This is Second Chance with You, Baxter Boys, Book 4. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 5, Chapters 17 through 20. Chapter 17. Monday morning, Ben woke without an alarm. Funny how the older he got, the less he seemed to be able to sleep. Or maybe he just had more interesting things to think about. Whatever it was, he got up and showered. It had been a long afternoon with Graham yesterday. She was used to being active and didn't make a very good patient. It wasn't that she wasn't allowed to move. She just wasn't allowed to move as much as she was used to. That, and she couldn't eat steak. Or bacon. Still, Riley and the twins had come, and they'd spent most of the day on lawn chairs in the backyard until Turbo and Harris had come in the evening to relieve them. While sitting there in the long afternoon, he'd had an idea about something he could do in the yard here at the farmhouse. He kind of wanted to surprise Riley with it, but since it wasn't his house, he'd probably better get permission first. Then the saying, "It's easier to get forgiveness than permission," ran through his head, and he figured, what could it hurt? Riley had mentioned a business trip next week. He'd think about doing it then. When he looked out the door, the eastern sky was just starting to glow, and Riley was at the rail, waiting on him. He hadn't been sure she'd be there. After all, he was the one who had quit with their little early morning meetings Saturday morning when he'd been angry. Although she's the one that said she was quitting. It was nice she forgave him so easily. Her head turned when he opened the door and stepped out still in his bare feet. Her eyes crinkled, and her smile hit him straight in the gut. Maybe he was foolish to come out and expose his heart. "Good morning, Ben," she said softly. "Morning." He walked slowly to her. Their eyes held as he walked to the rail beside her. He didn't put his arm around her like he'd longed to do all night. Would she lean into him like she did at the hospital? Or like she had in Graham's hall? He was willing to take the chance, but he didn't want to push Riley. He breathed in the scent he would forever associate with sweet happiness. They didn't talk a lot. The sunrise touched their faces, turning them pink, then orange, along with the wide expanse of sky over the low mountain bench in the distance. Somehow this morning he was aware of every breath she took, every time the slight breeze took her hair and shifted it. He wanted to touch her skin, feel her heart against his, but he reminded himself it wasn't his right. He had his eyes on the sky, trying to focus on the beauty before him, his forearms resting on the banister, his hands clasped, when her fingertips touched his arm. He almost jumped out of his skin from the charge. His eyes snapped to hers, but she was looking at the flaming sky, as though in awe. Her light touch scrambled his brain and made the sunrise pale in comparison to the feeling that stirred in his soul. Pretty sure that wasn't part of the fake marriage bargain. Whatever was going on between them, he hoped he'd be able to stand it when it ended. "Tell me again why there's such a rush in finishing this?" Torque thumped the brick that Jamal handed him down in the flat layer of sand. He shifted it slightly, then looked at Ben. Ben shrugged. "You don't have to stay." "Thinking your ears need cleaning, man. Didn't say I didn't want to stay." He held his hand out for the next brick that Jamal set in his hand. "I asked what the rush was." Ben took the other brick Jamal handed him. He should have worn gloves. He'd already smashed the pointer finger on his left hand. It wasn't bleeding out the cracked nail anymore, but it still throbbed. He set his brick before he answered Torque. I wanted to surprise Riley and have it done before she got home. She's not coming home until Tuesday. It's Friday night. Torque slid over on his knees and took another brick from Jamal. Ben slid in the opposite direction. They'd already made the stone fire ring. He'd welded the large 3-foot in diameter metal inside ring together at the Coleman shop yesterday. It was installed as well. He'd prepared the ground Wednesday night after he'd visited Graham. That's when he'd seen Torque and told him what he was doing. Torque and Jamal had just shown up tonight around 7, straight from work, since they were both just as grease-covered as he was. Ben knew he didn't really need to answer Torque, but the fact that his brother knew he was working on a project and had come to lend a hand without being asked, it kind of made him feel like he actually had a real family, for the first time since his mother died. Not that the twins weren't real, but he was more like a dad to them than a brother. I can't just sit around the house while she's gone. I need to be busy. A flash of white teeth shone in the light of the floodlights. Jamal laughed. Dad's the same way, Uncle Ben. He can't sit still when Mom's not home. A little thrill went through him every time one of his nieces or nephews called him Uncle Ben. Jamal handed him another brick, then hurried around to give another one to Torque. The hardest part was getting the pattern started. At this point, they were almost done, and the bricks went in easily. They would form a nice paving circle around the fire ring, decorative and also acting as a safety ring for stray sparks. You're gonna finish this tonight. Then what are you gonna do? Torque asked, sliding down again, then slapping another brick in place. I don't know. Maybe if I'm lucky, the toilet will back up and I'll have to dig the septic system up. Torque snorted. He looked at Jamal. If that happens, we're busy. Jamal chuckled again. His voice was cracking a little. He was right at that point where he sounded like a little boy most of the time, with occasional flashes of the deepened man's voice he'd have next year this time. Whatever, Dad. All your brothers have to do is say they're doing something, and you're there helping. Torque didn't say anything else, but Ben felt that familiar warmth spreading in his chest. He was one of the brothers. He'd come in after being gone for years, running away, avoiding his family because of his dad, and yet they'd accepted him without question. The back door slammed, and Cassidy walked out, a black-haired twin walking on either side of her. Yes, Jamal said. She's got drinks. I think your sisters are carrying cookies. Torque's eyes lingered on his wife. He looked at Cassidy the way Ben wanted to look at Riley. I heard you pull in. Ben had heard the car too, but he'd assumed it was one of the caretakers. Torque would recognize the sound of his wife's car. I set some food on the counter. She bent down and kissed her husband before handing him a bottle of water. Torque tossed it over the fire ring, and Ben caught it. Thanks. He jerked his head as a twin wiggled into each arm. Cassidy said, You're welcome. This looks amazing. You guys are coming over to our house next week to put one in there, right? Maybe the next week. I think Ben's doing some plumbing first. One side of Torque's mouth pulled up. Ben grunted. Okay. Cassidy looked between them. Inside joke? It probably depends if Aunt Riley goes away again. Uncle Ben is the same as Dad when you aren't home. Oh, so he put the spice rack in alphabetical order and moved Riley's makeup to the basement so he could put a toolbox the size of South Dakota under the bathroom sink? Cassidy asked with a quirked brow. I didn't touch the spice rack. Ben put both hands in the air in innocence. Cassidy put a hand on her hip. I did not put your makeup in the basement, Torque said as the twins crawled over him. That's only because I caught you as you were coming down the stairs with it. Torque looked over at Ben. Don't ever touch your wife's makeup. This probably wasn't the time to confess that he'd never been in his wife's bathroom. Noted.
The other day when I was talking to Riley, she said she didn't know if you two were staying here in Pennsylvania.
Cassidy plucked a twin off Torque so he could drink his water. Yeah, we're not real sure what we're going to do. Ben met Cassidy's gaze. It was the first time since the sun went down that he wished the floodlights weren't so bright.
Obviously, it's up to you and what's best for you guys, but I know your brothers would love for you to come back to PA and stay.
She's right, Torque spoke, surprising Ben. I guess I spent a lot of years angry that you left. We didn't know you had a mother in Maine. After getting to know you and Riley, at the very least, we'd like to stay in touch. Ben studied the cap he held between his fingers. In order for his deceit to work, he had to disappear after they'd finished their work here. When he'd made his bargain with Riley, he'd never dreamed he'd actually like his brothers or want to be a part of their lives. Everything had changed. He looked up and met Torque's brown eyes just like his own, across the fire ring. I'd like that too. It was an honest answer. Chapter 18. Ben sat back on his haunches, surveying his handiwork. Finally finished. Cassidy had left shortly after she'd come, taking the twins. Torque and Jamal had headed out an hour ago when all that was left to do was spread the sand in the cracks. He would have stayed until it was completely done, but Ben had sent him home to his wife. He grabbed his water bottle and took a swig. It felt more like 6 months than 3 days that Riley had been gone. Thankfully, he had a truck coming in tomorrow for a rebuild and could spend the rest of the weekend on it, working late both nights. He appreciated Torque coming because what he hadn't gotten done tonight would have had to wait. But he'd finished it, so he would get to surprise Riley after all. 8 hours on Wednesday night, 8 last night, and 6 tonight. The perfect circle with an inner circular steel core, outer stone sides, and a 4-foot-wide brick circular floor around it was finished. It had been a good idea, since he wasn't sleeping much anyway with her gone. Funny how short of a time it took for him to get used to watching the sun come up with her, and eating breakfast with her, and driving to work with her. Driving home. Cooking supper. Sitting on the porch swing and watching the sun go down. It was a little unbelievable how much he missed her. He took another swig of his water. Eve and Eden had decided to finish this semester of classes, at least, which was only another month or so, and come down for the summer. Now they could sit beside the stone fire ring. They could even cook supper over the fire. Graham would love it, and all the nieces and nephews would have a great time. He laughed to himself. He needed a swing set to make it good for the nieces and nephews. But he hoped Riley would love it. Maybe he should have asked before making such a drastic change to her backyard, but he'd broached the subject in a generic way, and she'd seemed open to the idea. A little wave of anxiety went through him. If she didn't like it, he supposed he could take it out. He sighed and finished off his water. Tired, but not sleepy, he knew he'd just go upstairs and toss and turn. Riley had texted him every night when she got back to her family's house where she was staying, but she hadn't texted tonight. Whether that meant she forgot, or whether that meant she was still out, he didn't know, and couldn't think about. He'd really go crazy if he had to try to imagine what Riley might be doing running around at midnight. Now that his hands were no longer busy, it was even worse. He got to his feet, shoving his hands in his pockets and walking over to the side of the porch, leaning against it. Why hadn't she texted? Crossing his arms over his chest, he stared off into the night, trying to get his mind to focus on anything other than Riley in a ditch somewhere, Riley attacked by thugs, Riley in the hospital, Riley only taking 3 days to forget about him when he couldn't stop thinking about her. The hum reached him first. He cocked his head. Then lights shone by the house. The hum grew closer, and he knew for sure. Riley hadn't texted because she'd been on her way home. Thrilled excitement pulsed hot and prickly through his blood. He waited for the lights to shut off before he walked around the side of the house. Running would be unseemly, but that's what he wanted to do. Hurry to her car door and sweep her up in a big hug and hello kiss. She popped the trunk, and he went straight back to get her suitcase. She might be his wife, but a hug probably wasn't appropriate either. Maybe she wasn't home early because she missed him. It could be something else. He pulled her suitcase and shoulder bag out, slamming the trunk.
"Oh,"
Riley said from beside the car.
"I wasn't expecting you to be up."
He looked at her. He hadn't even left the front porch light on since he wasn't expecting her home, so the 3/4 moon was the only light. Did she really think he'd go to bed not having heard from her? "You didn't text." She smiled.
"Because I was coming home."
Irritation sizzled up his spine. Didn't she know he'd want to know that she was safe? Her smile faded.
"I can get that. You don't have to put yourself out because of me."
He ground his teeth together, like he was going to let her carry the heavy suitcases when he was right here. "I've got them. Just get in the house." She was in his way, and he couldn't walk around the car.
"I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own luggage."
She put her hands on her hips.
"And maybe I don't want to go in the house."
She wasn't acting the slightest bit happy to see him. In fact, she seemed put out because he was carrying her bags. Of course, he knew she could do it, but he wouldn't feel like a man if he stood and watched her lug her stuff in without helping her. Could she really be that dense? Maybe she was trying to make him feel worthless. No, wait. This was Riley. She wasn't mean, and she didn't hate him. Maybe she was tired. He shoved his irritation back. It wasn't considerate of her to not text and let him know she was okay, but it was dumb for him to get upset about it. She wasn't one of the twins. Maybe she really didn't realize that he wouldn't sleep until he was sure she was fine. He swallowed, striving for a neutral tone. "If you don't feel like going in the house, I did something in the backyard. You can check it out and tell me what you think." She stopped with her mouth open. It closed. Her aggressive stance melted as her shoulders slumped.
"I'm sorry,"
she said softly.
"I was acting like a child just now."
His hand tightened on the handles of her luggage. He breathed in. Her scent filled his lungs. He'd missed it. He'd worried. But he couldn't tell her that. So he acted irritated instead. Then she thought he wasn't happy to see her. Sometimes he was just stupid. He set her bags down and stepped forward. Her head jerked up. Her eyes widened as she must have realized his intent. He moved slowly, giving her the chance to step back or to the side, to tell him to stop. But she didn't. She took a half step forward and met him. Their eyes held as he stopped, wrapping his arms around her slim waist, feeling her heat and softness. It wasn't the first time they'd embraced, but always before it had been for an audience. Except the time in Graham's hall, with Graham being in the bedroom close by. This time, they were alone. She stiffened, and his heart cramped before she melted against him. Her arms slipped around his waist. He trembled at the soft touch. She squeezed. He closed his eyes, resting his cheek on the top of her head. "I missed you," he said roughly. He forced his mouth to open. "I was worried about you when you didn't text." His whole chest constricted, trying to keep the next words in, but they came out anyway, raw and rough. "I couldn't figure out what you'd be doing running around Richmond at midnight. If you were hurt, if you were with someone." She froze in his arms. Then she pulled back just enough to throw her left hand in the air, twisting it so her grandmother's ring caught the moonbeams.
"I'm a married woman."
She lifted her face, staring into his eyes. "No one that you work with knows that," he said around the weight in his chest.
"I'm sorry you worried. I'm sorry I didn't text."
She pulled her lips in, her eyes heavy with contrition.
"I shoved all my meetings into the past 3 days because driving away from here was harder than I thought it would be, and every second I was gone, I longed to be back."
His heart beat heavy. "That's why you're home early?"
"Yes."
"Because you missed here?"
"No,"
she whispered.
"I missed you."
Their gazes held. A cool breeze blew, blowing strands of her hair across his forearm. Her body felt warm and alive under his hands. He didn't know what it meant or where they were going in their odd relationship, but he did know that he felt the world had been set back to rights now that Riley was in his arms. He pulled her close again, loving the way she came so easily, pressing into him. He didn't want to let her go, to try to untangle the convoluted mess of their relationship. But she had to be tired. "Let me carry your things in," he quickly added. "I know you can do it, but it makes me feel good to do it for you." She grunted. He considered that a win. "Then I'll show you what I did in the backyard."
"Okay,"
she said, her cheek still pressed against his chest, like she didn't want to let go any more than he did. Again, he wasn't sure what it meant, but he liked it. Chapter 19. Monday afternoon, Riley sat at her desk with her head in her hands. Trying to organize all the scattered paperwork had turned out to be a real nightmare. She couldn't believe how convoluted the person before her had been in their record-keeping. No wonder this terminal didn't perform to its potential. She'd sat in on a staff meeting first thing this morning and had spent the next 6 hours working on unwinding the electronic records. She stretched and stood. It was time for a break. Ben had texted that he was working through lunch, so she'd not seen him since this morning. Smiling at the memory of watching the sun come up with him, laughing a little more at the way his big body had jerked when she'd touched his arm again, she felt immensely lighter. She stopped at the cafeteria and grabbed a sandwich and water for them both before heading over to the shop. Her dad was gone, visiting their terminal in Virginia. He wouldn't be back until next week. Her stride hitched a little when she walked into the shop. The first shift guys were gone. Second shift was not as busy. She nodded to several guys she recognized, but her eyes kept going back to the woman's boots which stuck out from under the truck that was parked in Ben's bay. Ben's boots were right beside hers. Neither one of their torsos was visible, hidden by the big steer tire and motor. Riley forced her feet to keep moving. She'd been enjoying time with Ben, but they weren't really married. There was no exclusive agreement between them whatsoever. This pressure in her chest was uncalled for.
"I didn't realize you could do it that way."
The woman's voice drifted out from under the truck. Ben grunted. Some clanging and sharp bangs sounded. Ben's feet moved like he was exerting pressure.
"Oh, here, let me.
The woman's voice came again. Riley tried to remember the woman's name. She'd seen it on the shop reports. Fran. She was pretty sure that was it. Suddenly, Ben's body shot into sight, like he'd grabbed the truck and pushed off in frustration. The thunderclouds in his eyes eased when he saw Riley. He sat up, a wrench in one hand, the other hand running through his hair. "Get rid of her, please," he mouthed.
"With pleasure,"
Riley mouthed back. The woman slid out. Her jeans were tight, her t-shirt tighter.
"Why'd you leave?"
She pouted. Her expression changed as she caught sight of Riley. Riley smiled.
"Hi, Fran. I'm here to do a spot inspection, and your number came up. Can you take me to your workstation and show me your daily maintenance and equipment log, please?"
The woman's brows drew down, and her lips pushed out.
"I thought Ben did the inspections." "I'm Ben's boss, and I report to the company owner. Inspections are Ben's job and my responsibility. Lead on, please."
Ben mouthed, "Thank you," as she followed Fran to the other end of the shop. Riley held the sandwiches and drinks up as she walked away. Ben jerked his head in acknowledgement with a grin. 25 minutes later, Riley was back. Ben had a cracked air-to-air lying beside the truck, his boots sticking out as he lay on the creeper, and Riley could only assume he was under there putting the new one on. Riley looked down through the frame rails.
"If you need help, I can get Fran to come back."
"And I can go lie down on the hammer lane of the closest interstate."
"Please, no. I need you."
Ben grunted and slid out. "Not, Ben, I like you and don't want to see anything happen to you. Nope, I get turn the company around first, then jump off a bridge."
"You're fishing for a compliment? I'd have thought you'd have your ego stroked with Fran down here lying under the truck with you."
She handed him a sandwich and water. "I know it's often the other way around, men harassing women. I've seen it. But man, I wish she'd find someone else to bother. I spent half my time today running from her." He took the lid off and took a deep drink.
"Looked like she caught you when I walked in."
"I was sick of not getting anything done."
"I can transfer her."
"I can too." He lifted a brow at her. She tilted her head to acknowledge the truth in his words. Officially, he wasn't allowed to deal directly with employee movement. Unofficially, she'd bowed to his decisions for years. How was she to know who worked well and who didn't?
"I ran the numbers for last week. We're already seeing improvement here."
"Here." She sighed.
"Yeah, here in the shop. Upstairs, not so much."
"What's up?" He took a bite of the sandwich.
"Just still trying to untangle the records mess."
"That bad?"
"It's worse."
"It's looking good here. I've got a few things I want to implement, but I'm waiting until I've been here a bit and people have accepted me." Riley nodded. It was technically against company policy for a supervisor to do the work of a mechanic, but the guys accepted him a lot easier and faster if he worked. Not to mention, it made sense.
"You've never had a problem with people liking you."
He shrugged. "Guys respect a hard worker. I found it out by accident back when I didn't have a choice about working hard." Riley nodded. It had become part of his character. He changed the subject. "I have 2 trucks sitting down there that could be fixed and on the road, except we're out of the parts I need, which we should have known and they should have been automatically ordered, but the parts aren't being checked out. That's definitely a time waster that needs to be changed immediately." Riley's brain was calculating.
"You need a whole new system?"
"No," he said firmly. "The computer system is great. I need the guys to use it properly. Some guys forget to check their parts out, which also means that we're not getting paid for them if it's an outside job."
"I see."
"Right. Anyway, I know exactly how I'm going to take care of it. I just don't want to rock the boat too soon.
Yep, that gets people upset.
They finished their sandwiches in silence.
What time are you quitting today?
Riley asked. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against the drives. I can quit any time. This truck's done. I have one coming in on the hook, needs to be rebuilt, but night shift can steam it off. He looked her in the eye. I think we can get rid of night shift, to be honest.
Really?
Her eyes widened. That would be a big savings. We might have to have some second shift guys stay or cover occasionally, and maybe we'd need to reinstitute it if other shops' work got dumped on us like we did in Maine. But for now, it would solve the employee shortage. Nothing much gets done at night anyway.
No supervision.
Basically. She looked down, picking at her nail. I'm ready to go whenever you are. Just give me a 15-minute heads up to clean up my tools and wash up. Her face broke out in a smile. The heat from his seeped into her bones. She balled up her trash and finished her water.
Let me know if you need me to rescue you from Fran again.
I have plans for Fran. I just have to implement them slowly. She's going to be part of the big shakeup. They smiled together.
I'm going to work another couple of hours. Maybe cut out at 6?
Perfect. I'd like to visit Graham.
Of course.
Chapter 20. Riley had texted Ben and let him know she wasn't going to be able to quit, and if he wanted to see his Graham before she went to bed, he'd need to leave without her. He was glad he did, because all 3 of his brothers were outside with their wives and children when Eve and Eden and he pulled in. The trailer's backyard wasn't very big, but there was a small swing set for the kids. Graham was set up in a lawn chair, a blanket tucked around her legs, even though it wasn't cold out.
She looks like a queen holding court,
Eve said as they walked back. That was true. Ben's heart tugged in his chest. Harris sat in a lawn chair beside Graham, one hand on the gentle swell of her belly. Turbo was sprawled at her feet. Occasionally, one of Torque's twins would come over and jump on him, and he'd wrestle easily with them. Torque sat on the ground facing Graham, Cassidy leaning back between his legs, watching the kids and laughing, his arms around her. Tough lay on his side, one hand propping his head up, his body curved around Kelly, who sat on the ground and leaned against his stomach. "There's Ben and the twins," Turbo called out. "Come on over. We're out of lawn chairs, so you'll have to find a spot on the ground." Eve and Eden walked over and kissed Graham on the forehead before heading to the swing set to push Torque and Cassidy's dark-haired twins. Ben sat on the ground, leaning back on his hands. He couldn't quite meet Tuff's eyes. He'd thrown the note on his dresser but hadn't seen Tuff much since. He couldn't believe that Tuff had seen right through everything.
"Where's Riley?"
Cassidy asked. She got caught up in some work at the terminal and told me to come without her. He hadn't realized how much he wanted a wife. Not just any wife, but Riley, until he'd started spending time with her. But seeing his brothers and their wives together made the longing so much worse. Why couldn't he have that happiness? Not that he begrudged it of his brothers. He certainly didn't. After the childhood they'd all had, he deserved to be happy. "How are you feeling today, Graham?"
"Like I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired,"
she said with a snap in her voice. Ben grinned. She hadn't lost her spark. The talk turned to shop, and Ben enjoyed the easy camaraderie of men who worked with their hands for a living. He'd been there for an hour, and dusk had fallen when a car pulled in. From his position, he could only see headlights, but he was talking to Torque about fuel-to-air ratios in the new Cat engines, and since he wasn't expecting anyone, he didn't pay much attention. not even when his sisters hurried past to greet the newcomer. Then Riley walked around the corner of the trailer, Eve and Eden on either side of her, their arms around her narrow waist. Ben's heart stopped, and longing ripped through his chest. What if their marriage were real? He closed his eyes. He had to stop thinking like that. Just because his little brothers all were happy in their marriages didn't mean that he needed the same thing. He opened his eyes to find Riley's gaze sweeping across the yard, taking in the domestic couple sprawled on the ground, the kids on the swing set and playing in the sand, and Graham in her chair. Lastly, her eyes rested on him. She smiled, and his heart catapulted straight up into the sky. He didn't move. He didn't trust himself to not get up and go right to her and take her in his arms.
"Hey, everyone,"
Riley said. She moved away from the twins and bent down to kiss Graham on the cheek.
"How are you doing, Graham?"
Ben listened to her talk, his heart thumping in his chest. Where was she going to sit? If the couples weren't arranged the way they were, it wouldn't be a big deal. But if they were the only couple that wasn't together, it would be obvious. Ben leaned his head back, looking up at the stars that were just starting to shine. He turned his head. Tough stared at him. When Ben met his gaze, his brow moved a fraction of an inch, whatever that was supposed to mean. Maybe a reminder that he was supposed to tell Riley he loved her. Like he even knew what love was. He hadn't seen much of it in his life. His sisters and his mom. Loving his mom had hurt. Loving his sisters had meant a lot of tough decisions. Neither scenario was how he felt toward Riley. Something brushed one of his raised knees. A moment later, Riley settled between his legs, her posture confident. Only he could see the insecurity on her face as she waited to see his reaction. His whole body buzzed and ached. He'd wanted this for so long. Even if his entire family was watching, he would still savor and enjoy finally holding her close. He sat up and wrapped her in his arms, nuzzling her ear. "Thank you," he said, gratitude flowing like a river in flood stage through his chest.
"I'm sorry," she whispered back. "I didn't realize it was a couples thing tonight."
She turned her head so their lips were almost touching. He breathed her air. It didn't matter, but he lied.
"You shouldn't be alone."
"I'm not." She smiled. "You guys are acting like newlyweds, all whispery," Turbo said. Eve choked. Eden cleared her throat.
"They're always like that."
Ben's eyes shot to her. When did she become such a good liar? He felt Tuff's eyes on him again. Funny how that brother could say a whole speech with just a look. And even funnier how nothing missed his observation. He turned, just to make sure that Tuff wasn't going to rat him out. No worries there. Tuff had a small smile on his face. Ben held his gaze, leaning forward a fraction and kissing Riley on the temple. He returned the small smile. If it felt this good to hold her, to have her walk over and choose him, how good would it be if she really meant it? If she actually did choose him over everything, including her dad and his company? Even as he sat there, enjoying the closeness and warmth of Riley, he knew that was the only way he'd ever completely trust her after what she did. A couple of kids had come over and settled down beside their parents. The adults were chatting soft and low when a rumble vibrated on the ground. "Sounds like a Harley," Ben said. A headlight flashed. "It's Dusty," Torque replied. "Some dude on a bike." Did Riley like motorcycles? Funny that's the first thing that entered his head. He'd wanted a bike back in his 20s, but it wasn't practical with the twins, and he'd never gotten one. Maybe he'd buy one when he left Riley, a consolation of sorts. But until then, he was going to enjoy every moment with her, memorizing the feeling of not being alone anymore. The bike pulled up to the edge of the trailer and shut off. Ben glanced over at it. Some skinny guy in black leather sat on it, feet braced on each side. He turned back to Riley, gauging her reaction. If he bought a bike now, they could ride around together for the rest of the summer and fall. They couldn't talk like in a car, but she'd be snuggled up against him every day. But her brows were drawn together, and her eyes narrowed slightly. He nuzzled her ear. "I love that look." She stiffened.
"Yeah, most guys do."
He pulled back at her annoyed tone, ignoring the greetings of the adults around them. "Huh?" She was looking in the direction of the bike, but cut her eyes to his.
"The girl biker look. You didn't have to tell me. Most guys dig it."
Ben's eyes narrowed. He glanced over at the Harley. Sure enough, the slender boy had taken his helmet off, revealing long blonde hair and delicate facial features. "That's a girl."
"You keep stating the obvious."
Riley tilted her head.
"You weren't talking about Dusty?"
"That she's a girl? Yeah." He was missing something, but he couldn't figure out what.
"That you love the blonde on a bike look, taking her helmet off and shaking her hair out."
Oh, she thought he'd been talking about Dusty. Missed it. I was looking at this. He used one finger to stroke the lines between her eyes. "You look like that at work sometimes when you're trying to figure out a really tough problem. It's that super intelligent woman look that really drives me crazy." He hadn't meant to let all that come tumbling out of his mouth, but it was too late. Riley smiled.
"You really weren't looking at her."
"I don't know why you'd find that so hard to believe. There's only one woman I've ever been interested in looking at. And that really wasn't supposed to come out either." She stared into his eyes, and he couldn't look away, like their gazes had been welded together. The sounds around them faded away, and he hung on her every breath, waiting to see what she'd do with his declaration. Would she brush it off? Would she make one of her own? "Ben, Riley, I don't think you've ever met Dusty." Turbo stretched out a booted toe and nudged Ben's knee, effectively breaking the spell between them. "No, we haven't," Ben said, reluctantly moving to stand. "Don't get up," Dusty said, with her hand out. Ben liked that she held it out to Riley first and spoke to her. "You two look too cozy down there to move."
"I feel too cozy to move,"
Riley said, her smile genuine. She shook Dusty's hand.
"It's great to meet you." "It's nice to meet you too." Dusty's blonde hair contrasted with her black leather jacket. Ben reluctantly took his hand away from Riley to shake Dusty's. The calluses on her palm surprised him a little. That's when he noticed the slight droop of her eyes. Despite her smile, she seemed sad. Maybe she felt the same way he had when he walked back, alone, into all the happy couples. Dusty moved on, and Ben tucked his arm back around Riley. "That's the kind of girl I always pictured you with."
"Funny, since I could never picture you with anyone but me." She snorted like he'd made a joke, and he was a little glad she took it that way, although he hadn't meant it as a joke.
"I'm serious," she said. "Dusty rides a Harley, for goodness sake."
"So?"
"Isn't that something you're interested in?"
Owning a Harley? Maybe someday.
No, Goofy. A girl that does.
It was like she was trying to push him away, or push him toward Dusty. Either one. His heart hurt. Did she feel like he was getting too close? Too serious? He'd said more from his heart tonight than he'd ever said before. He needed to back off. The next day, Riley drove them to work since she had a business lunch to attend. Ben had been quiet and a little more aloof than usual, although they'd still watched the sunrise together. This time, they'd sat on the steps together, and he'd held her. She'd been more content than she could ever remember being, snuggled in his arms. But it was like he'd realized yesterday that maybe he would be interested in a girl like Dusty, or maybe in Dusty herself. She was afraid to ask. She dropped him off at the back of the garage before driving around and parking in her usual spot. Resting her hands on the wheel, she didn't get out right away. Sometime between last night and this morning, she realized that she was in love with Ben Baxter. Completely, head over heels, blindly in love with him. It started with the absolute, unreasonable jealousy that had erupted in her soul, for no reason, when she'd seen Dusty. Ben wasn't even looking at her, didn't spend more than 5 seconds talking to her. Yet, Riley had been unreasonably jealous for the first time in her life. And why not? Ben was amazing in every way. Riley grabbed her briefcase and got out of her car. She should tell Ben, but she couldn't. As she opened the door to the building using her key, she listed the reasons in her head. First of all, she was his boss. A relationship with a subordinate would be all kinds of wrong. Secondly, her dad had been clear. Everything she'd been working for her whole life was on the line. If he found out that she and Ben were together, she could lose everything. Would that be so horrible? She stopped short, her finger reaching for the elevator button. Wouldn't having Ben be better than a corner office and her dad's approval? She could hardly believe she was thinking this way. It had never crossed her mind before. She had always been so focused on work. The idea was bold and big and new, and she needed time to think about it. Before she could act on anything, though, she needed to do her part to turn this terminal around. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.